Hi, this is Steve Florison. Welcome to the Diploma of Youth Work. This is a Level 5 qualification and it's quite different from the Certificate 4, which was a Level 4 qualification. This will require you to read and analyse material and come to your own conclusions. It also requires you to be responsible for some work situations and also to explain processes to other people. And it also requires a higher language literacy and numeracy ability. The diploma requires that you carry out some assessments with real clients or real students, and so you can't use just scenarios as we did in the Certificate 4. So you need to show evidence of this. So you'll probably do that in your residence, your boarding residence, your place of work. These are small projects and very often they'll be things that you're probably already doing. You need to get permission from your head of boarding to do that. You will also need your head of boarding or your manager to sign off on some skills. On completion, you should have a very clear understanding about the role of a youth worker, the stages of development and the different constructs, the range of different contexts for young people, knowledge and skills that will enable you to meet the diverse needs of young people, and good processes for evaluating your practice. The Diploma of Youth Work requires that you're not just competent in the assessments, you don't just know the material, but you really know and you really must be able to perform as a youth worker in your particular context, whether that's in a boarding, residence or some other context. The first unit is Unit 18. It's like a foundation unit. It defines youth work. It has a history of youth work, the types of youth work values, constructs of young people and changing contexts. There's two assessments. Assessment 18.1 there's 14 questions, they're fairly detailed answers. 18.2 is a project and this covers 4 units. So we'll talk a little bit about that in the webinar. Firstly, we want to look at the definition. Youth work is a practice that places young people and their interests first, and you can see the bit that's highlighted in colour, and these are the really important parts of this definition. So it places young people and their interests first. It's a relational practice where the youth worker operates alongside the young person in their own context. Youth work is an empowering practice that advocates for and facilitates a young person's independence and participation in society, connectedness and realisation of their rights. So that's a definition of youth work, and this was put together by the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition, and you've got a document in your file about this. Putting this together was a long, involved process, and you might think, well, why is that? You know, it doesn't seem that hard to define youth work, but the problem is that there's blurred boundaries between people who define themselves as youth workers and all the other people who do work with young people. It's often difficult to define what is distinctive about youth work. There's a very broad scope of youth work, and we're going to look at some of the different types of youth work today, but youth work is very broad in its scope. There's some people who believe that actually defining youth work might actually put limitations on youth work and often take away from the spontaneous nature of the work. And there's been a lack of data because there's simply been a lack of funding. There's been no national funding for significant periods of time. So we want to start by having a look at the history of youth work in Australia. And as we do this, you'll see that there's different focuses. As youth work moved from these very early years, there were different focuses of youth work. So the very first focus was a faith focus, and these were Sunday schools in the early 1800s. And Governor Macquarie, whose idea was to civilise this unruly colony, established these Sunday schools. And what happened was that there was a group of people called the Rum Corps, and these were soldiers or people who were in charge of the settlement, and they were largely out of hand, and they were bringing a lot of alcohol into the settlement. They were transferring land to their friends, all of those sort of things. And he came into the colony and wanted to bring some order. And one of the things that he did was to establish these Sunday schools, which we're calling a faith-based or religious focus to youth work. And so over the years, we saw other faith-based focuses, such as the YMCA and the YWCA, the Anglican Home Mission, which is now Anglicare, of course, and the biggest aid agency in Australia, the Salvation Army, and the Tri Society. The Tri Society believed that you could work with young people by, taking them out into the country and reforming them, that sort of thing. So this first focus was faith-based. The second focus was settlement houses, and this focus was really a social reform type focus. And so what happened was that they would set up a house in a neighbourhood where there were issues or where there were low socioeconomic situation, and they would bring in people who would be an influence on those people in that area. They would have classes and all that sort of thing. And there were settlement houses all over Australia, Canada, England, places like that. And there's even a settlement house that's still operating today in Sydney. So the second focus was a social reform focus. Third focus was a focus on values, and we saw things like Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, Boys Brigade, that sort of thing. Then we had this focus on social justice, and you had the Eureka Youth League, that sort of thing. Then we had a focus on fitness, and we had national fitness councils in the States. This was prior to World War II and after the First War. So we had this focus on fitness. So the youth work focus was a focus on fitness. And then in the 1960s, we had the rise of the New Left, and this started in universities, places like that. And the focus was a political and social reform. And this dealt with a lot of things like the Vietnam War, that sort of thing. In the 1980s, the industry, the youth work industry, started to become more professional. The role of the youth worker was more formally recognised, and youth work training and youth work degrees started. And it's hard to imagine this now, but there was very little actual formal training for youth workers prior to this. People thought that youth work was something, not a real job, but something that you did in your spare time. There were some youth organisations. CYSS, this is a Community Youth Support Scheme, established in 1976. And this established lots of community-based projects to provide support for young people, particularly for unemployed young people. Next, we had the SAP, which is Supported Accommodation Program, and this had a specific youth arm. And then in 2002, we had the Australian Youth Affairs Coalition, and this has been a pretty important organisation and has influenced youth work significantly in Australia. Australian Youth Affairs Coalition represents the interests and issues of young people and the sector that supports them, which is us, of course. And it offers policy advice, promotes the well-being of young people, advances participation of young people in the community, supports best practice and takes a leadership role, encourages and supports coordination and cooperation within the sector. So at the moment it has been defunded, it doesn't have funding or very limited funding, so it is not as big or influential as it has been in the past, but it has been a very important part of the direction and focus of youth work in Australia. When we look at the early history of youth work in Australia, going right back to those Sunday schools set up by Governor Macquarie, you can see that there's some practices that were acceptable at the time, but are not acceptable anymore. And they're things like corporal punishment, those sort of things. There are some practices that were unacceptable then, and they are still unacceptable today, but they did happen, sadly, and it's been a part of the history of youth work in Australia, where there has been abuse of young people and sexual abuse of young people, and that is sadly a part of our history as well. We want to have a quick look at models and types of youth work. When we do this, we need to recognise that there's basically two types of youth work. This is the most common type is the face-to-face youth work, where you're actually working with young people. But there is also the organisational administrative youth work, policy development, all of that sort of thing. So those people tend not to actually be working face-to-face with young people, but they're still involved in youth work. When you look at youth work types in Australia, you can see these ones here: accommodation services, employment assistance, training programs, education programs, counselling, recreation services. You've got community development, case management, street work, health services, drug and alcohol services, legal and court support, crime prevention. There's probably others too that I haven't thought of, but there are a lot of different types of youth work in Australia. And if you're in a boarding residence, of course, that is a form of youth work as well. So when we look at categorising these, we look at first of all community youth work. Community youth workers provide community-based activities for young people in a variety of settings throughout the local community. You've got youth empowerment, and when I think about this, I think about leadership courses, leadership programs, but there's lots of other youth empowerment as well. Centre-based youth work, based around a centre where young people can come and gather. Faith-based youth work, there's a lot of churches that have youth groups. Some of these youth groups are very big, and there's a lot of youth work that happens as a part of the church programs. Detached youth work, sometimes referred to as street work, and in its purest form, detached youth work is a form of street-based youth work provision, which operates without the use of a centre, and it can be, quite unorganised. And it takes many different forms, detached youth work. And then we have outreach youth work. And outreach youth work are people who go out and work where young people are, but they come from a centre, so that they outreach from a centre. We've got school-based youth work, where youth workers will come in and work with young people in a school. Youth development, all different types of youth development projects. So these are the different types of youth work in Australia. And so you'll see that there's one of the assessments is to look at the different the different types of youth work, and from your own experience identify 6 types of youth work that you're familiar with. Next, we want to look at models of youth work, and this comes from work developed by Cooper and White. This was started in the 1990s, and these models are still the models that are recognised today. So we're looking at treatment, reform, advocacy and empowerment as models of youth work. And you can see that advocacy and empowerment have radical and non-radical elements. So treatment, the treatment model defines young people as deficient or deviant. And this model assumes that all members of society agree on an acceptable standard of behaviour, and that what we need to do is to treat these young people and to bring them into line. Then we have the reform model. The reform model defines young people as being socially disadvantaged by their environment. They can be social outcasts or whatever, and so the reform model seeks to reform them to bring them back into line. Then we've got advocacy. So the radical advocacy model defines young people as being marginalised by current society through inadequate basic rights or social protection. and young people are ill-informed as to their rights and how do we access them. So this model advocates for those people, those young people. The non-radical part of this is where the young person is defined in this model as having problems because they just don't understand their rights, not because society has actively prevented them from their rights. So that's a non-radical part of advocacy. Empowerment. The radical part of this model contends that institutions operate to protect the privileged and the powerful, and they systematically disempower young people. And so the non-radical part of this just says that young people don't have enough control or power over their lives, and they need to be empowered. So they are the different models from Cooper and White, the four models with the two radical elements. So this is in your assessments, you'll see this is question 9. Just want to have a quick look at rights for young people, and you'll see an attachment in your notes on the rights for young people in South Australia. And I'd really encourage you to read through this and also just think about how many of those things you didn't actually know. There'll be one of these rights documents for students, young people in every state. The assessment here, question 4, is asking you to write down 6 of these rights that are the most important for your residents. And we would hope that if you're in a boarding residence, if you're doing this youth work qualification, in a boarding residence, that you might take a document like this and talk to your students about their rights over a period of time, because very often young people are confused about these rights and don't understand these rights. The next part of this is about ethics, and there's 2 documents. You have 2 documents in there about ethics, or a code of ethics, and the ethics of youth work look at these things here: the primary client, ecology, non-discrimination, empowerment, non-corruption, transparency, confidentiality, cooperation, knowledge, self-awareness, boundaries, and self-care. Self-care is, looking after yourself, making sure you don't get too tired or stressed out doing this sort of work. So self-care is an ethic. So there's 2 documents there, and this assessment here, question 10, asks you to choose 3 values from the Code of Ethics and show how they are person-centered. And then this next question asks you to look at this youth manifesto policy and answer questions from that. Question 11 asks, how does your residents achieve each of these values? The values are important, and this assessment asks how you achieve these values. We want to move now and look at constructs of youth. So the word construct is like how we view young people, our perception of young people. If we go back to 1962, we've got a book written by Philip Ayres, a French historian, and this book was very important for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it was the first book that looked at young people from a social perspective rather than just a biological perspective. The other was that it raised great controversy because he made claims like in medieval society the idea of childhood did not exist. And so the book was very controversial in its day, and it's still debated today. What do we know for sure? We do know for sure that childhood was very different for people in earlier centuries. So what happened generally was that working class children were contributing to family survival as soon as possible. They were out working, even when they were very young. And wealthy children started going to school. So from probably about 1200, we started to see boys particularly going to school, and the length of their childhood increased, particularly for boys. So what we mean by that is that the time when they actually started work, went out and earned an income for their family or for themselves, it slowly became later and later. So it might have been 12 years old, then 13 years old, and then 15, 16, 17 years old. So from the years 1200 to 1600, the length of childhood increased for boys, but it didn't change very much for girls at all. So, for a lot of that period of time, girls could be married and in charge of a household at 14 years of age. So it was quite different for boys and girls, quite different for whether you're wealthy or poor. In the 1700s and the 1800s, childhood became commercialised. We had, toys, books and games, and a lot more of these things. There was education into the early teens for boys and girls to an earlier age for parents who could pay. If we look at Australian Indigenous parents, they have traditional child rearing practices which are quite different to Australian non-Indigenous parents. Young people are self-reliant at a young age. They participate in adult tasks, and there's a ceremony to go into adulthood for boys. If we have a look at the new arrivals to Australia, it must have been an interesting place to come to. Australia was basically a penal colony with convicts and people who were managing convicts. So you basically had those two. In the very early days, you had convicts or people who were managing convicts. They were the people who were here. Then we started to get settlers come, and we also had ticket of leave or ex-convicts who settled Australia as well. In the 1830s, there was a view that crime resulted from a lack of education, and so the government provided money for schools, teachers and books, and everybody could access education theoretically. We know that in practice, people could not access education, particularly Indigenous young people, and even non-Indigenous young people couldn't access education. This was a huge move, though, in the 1830s, and there was a standardised curriculum right across Australia, so it didn't matter whether you belonged to a church school or a remote bush school. Everybody had the same curriculum. So it was a very big, bold move in the 1830s. In the 1870s, school attendance became compulsory. Again, it was a big move, I guess, but it was impossible to monitor, and still some young people, like Indigenous young people, did not have access to schools, and many Australian young people still did not go to school. So remember, we're looking at constructs of young people. There was a construct around this time, 1850s, 1860s, which wanted young people to be controlled. So they wanted to control Australia's young people. Society wanted Australian young people who would safeguard and advance society. And so they had these ideals of manliness and increased vigour. They wanted these young people to be able to go out and fight and, be, soldiers, that sort of thing. That was a construct, an early construct of young people. Another construct that followed immediately on from that in the 1870s was about suppressing the masculine qualities in favour of an effeminate manliness, intellectualism, godliness and moral maturity. And this came about because in the 1870s and 1880s there was a concern that young people, young men particularly, were descending into barbarism, that they were becoming irreligious and vulgar, and this particularly was exacerbated because they were removed so far from European civilization. So this was the second construct, and it's amusing when you look at it today to see how they moved from this, soldier type tough construct of young people to this masculine, suppressed masculine construct. In the early 1900s, there were perceived threats to Australia, things like the Boer War, and they wanted tough young men who could defend the country and conquer inland Australia. And so they reworked this idea of the suppressed manliness. They reworked that idea to focus more on physical strength, courage, chivalry, patriotism, and military capability. All through this time, you had the larrikin movement, and this was general poor behaviour. So when we think about a larrikin today, we think about a a nice, funny kind of person who's just a bit of a larrikin, messes around, that sort of thing. This is a different meaning of the word larrikin. These people generally had poor behaviour, fighting, often drunk. They were subject to over-policing. There was a lot of violence and antisocial behaviour. It was associated with lower socio-economic areas, and there were ladettes as well. So larrikin is the male part of this, and you also had women who were ladettes. And there are larrikin belts in cities at the time, and there still are today, and you can probably identify the larrikin belt of your particular place. But these were a construct of young people. Another construct was that young people are unemployed. They don't have work. And it is true that youth unemployment is always about twice as high as the general unemployment rate. In the 1980s and 1990s, it got to be about 20%, so it was quite high. And before the Depression, the Australian government were very worried that we would have very large numbers of, the words that they used were armies of unemployed young people, and that didn't actually happen. Another construct of young people is that they need controlling, that they're antisocial, out of control, and they need to be managed or controlled by the society that they live in. This construct was very dominant in Australia in the 1950s and 1960s, and this mellowed and changed during the Whitlam years. We had very significant social changes during the early 70s, during the Whitlam years. So there's lots of other constructs of youth that they need educating or moulding, that they are an asset for the country, that they've got innovative and worthwhile ideas, and so all of these are constructs of young people. We want to move now and look at the contexts of young people, and particularly the changing context, and we're looking a bit at the work of Johanna Wynne, who's an academic in this field. So she's saying that there are three main changing contexts. One is a greater complexity of pathways through youth. The second is adulthood is achieved incrementally and earlier than previous generations. And the third is about well-being. So the first is looking at the pathways, the pathways from being a child to an adult. In the post-war Australia, there was a lot of stability and growth. There was a lot of jobs and prosperity. In fact, we were looking for people, bringing migrants in to work in the agriculture and mining industries. And there were very defined pathways. You either left school early and went to work or get an apprenticeship, or you went on at school and stayed at university or went to college. But the nature of work has changed significantly, and this is due to globalisation, new technologies, a decline in manufacturing, a lot of jobs moving offshore, that sort of thing. So the nature of work in Australia has very significantly changed. There are very complex and uncertain pathways through the youth years There's no certainty of employment, even if you complete a degree or training. There's no certainty of continuing employment. Everything is based on short-term contracts, and or nearly everything is based on short-term contracts. So young people are seeing that there's a need to be flexible. They really need to be very flexible in how they approach their work situations, as they because work is morphing from a place into an activity. There's less rigidity in the structure. Workflow can be more natural and spontaneous. Time boundaries are blurring as well, and this is partly to do with devices which enable us to work at different times and in different places. Many people actually work from home. So young people have to respond to these changes. They need to remain of value in the labour market. The labour markets are very flexible and very precarious, so young people need to hold their options open, respond to changing markets, balance being in the present with an orientation to the future, being a worker and a student. So often you'll see a young person who's in a job, employed in a job, but they actually have they're actually doing study or training for something else at the same time. The next part of this is where we see adulthood achieved incrementally and earlier. So the relevance of age as a transition marker is reduced, puberty is achieved earlier, access to knowledge is achieved earlier, and there are lots of other cognitive and social emotional changes as well. The irony of this is that we've always had 5 core transition indicators, and they are things like leaving home, completing school, entering the workforce, getting married and having children. The paradox is that all of these are now happening later for young people. So they may be growing up earlier, but these indicators are being achieved later. The other is this emphasis on well-being. There's a paradox here too, because there's a strong emphasis on physical, personal, social well-being amongst young people, but there's also a lot of risk-taking, use of drugs, drinking at unsafe levels as well. So looking at all of this, there's a lot of material to assimilate and think about in this particular unit, and I hope that you will go through the notes and read it, read the attachments, look at the attachments, that sort of thing. This is the foundation for this whole diploma, this unit here, providing the definitions, the constructs of youth work. So how can we apply it in our own practice? It should help us understand young people and the pressures they face, understand the different constructs, the historical context of young people, the current types and models of youth work. It should help us to be able to define youth work, to know what it actually is, and to understand and to know ethical practice working with young people. That last is very important. This should lead to a greater level of professionalism in boarding residences, as we're more able to understand the social and cultural practice of young people and understand how these impact on decisions that we make, allowances that we make, rights and responsibilities that we give. This helps us to understand values that underpin the Australian youth work, to embrace codes of ethics, and it should impact on the way that we interact with young people. So it's a values base for identifying practice also that is not consistent. So this is the first unit in the Diploma of Youth Work, and I wish you well with it.